Alright, so, first of all, I don't seriously expect anyone to believe me. Basically, I guess the best way to sum it up is I'm kind of hoping that this will be therapeutic in a way, even if, no one believes my story, you know, I'm just hoping that it will help in some small way to kind of get this off of my chest about what really happened. And I don't know how much of this I'm gonna get straight. I'm I still wonder which parts actually did happen and which ones were brought on in some fever nightmare since it hasn't even been that long since that night, and yet somehow it feels like it's been a decade already. And I fully realize how stupid my actions were. I mean, hindsight is 2020 and all that. I know now that it was irresponsible of me to take my baby cousin out in the middle of the night just to see some goddamn weirdo in a bird suit, and how dangerous it could have been even if it was just that. Don't think that I haven't replayed a million better courses of action in my mind since then. Also, I'm well aware of how crazy you're going to think I am after hearing this. And I couldn't really give less of a shit at this point. Right now it feels like reaching rock bottom would be not dissimilar to descending the final step on a flight of stairs. So, I'm really not worried about what people think of me. Now, Jesse was my best friend at the time, and I suppose that it would be fair to say that he's still my best friend to this day, since I haven't really made any connections with people since the night of his death. So, we were both very young, and I suppose you could say that we were naive at the time, and I'm not even trying to make excuses for either of us. It's just the way that it was. So, it started one night when Jesse gave me a phone call at this ungodly hour just to tell me about this big bird that he had seen. And that was literally all he said at first, so I ended up just cussing him out, going on about how fucking dumb it was for him to be calling me in the middle of the night just to tell me that. But after listening to my vitriol, he said something along the lines of, dude, it's this guy in a bird suit who's got everyone in this little redneck town scared shitless, and it's hilarious. I mean, he just walks around doing bird things, and you can't even take the man seriously looking at him. The suit is bright fucking yellow like a canary, and every time I hear someone talking about him, they're like terrified out of their minds, saying things like, make sure to lock the door so the big bird doesn't get in, and stupid shit like that. I don't know whether this guy is trolling people or just playing out of his fucking mind or both, but It's hilarious, and you really need to come see this shit tomorrow night. I promise you, you will laugh your ass off. Now, to kind of give you a little context here, Jesse was doing this pretty dumb project where he was blowing his college money to explore these small towns that were in our state so that he could compile a book about all of the weird stuff that he found along the way. I guess it was kind of like the poor man's version of Weird Indiana that he was making, or, weird whatever state. And, in comparison to some of the other shit that he'd been telling me about, this one actually had me pretty interested. Like, I mean, the previous week he had called me just to tell me about this porta potty that had burned down. So, a crazy guy in a bird suit wreaking havoc definitely sounded more interesting. So I agreed to come out with him the following night, which made me a fucking dumbass because I had also agreed beforehand to babysit my baby cousin Billy that same night. Now, I actually kind of enjoyed babysitting Billy. He was 6 years old at the time, and really, my aunt and uncle didn't even need to pay me to look after him. The reason being that the boy was a rarity because he never cried. I mean, never. He cried when he was a baby, obviously, because it just wouldn't have been normal if he hadn't. But strangely, after age 3, he just became more quiet. Even if he got himself hurt, he handled himself in a surprisingly mature way. We used to have this uncle named Dodge who would joke around that Billy was a serial killer in the making. And I used to laugh at that. But anyway, I decided that taking him along wasn't going to be any big harm. I told him that we were going to be able to see the animal that had inspired Big Bird for Sesame Street, which, he thought was a joke at first, but, being the older man with more knowledge, I convinced him that I was telling the truth and that we were going to see an actual Big Bird. And, he got pretty excited once he believed me. He even asked if we could look at it up close, which, I kind of thought about that for a moment, but I ended up saying sure. I figured that even if it turned out that this bird guy was some kind of lunatic, and even if things got a little hairy, Jesse and I would make sure that no harm came to Billy. Even if for some reason I ended up out of commission, I knew that Jesse would be able to handle it, which is kind of important for me to note right now. So far, I don't know, I feel like I've just made Jesse out to be this big idiot, and I mean, he did do a lot of dumb things, but really, he had a heart of gold. As corny as it is to say, he was the type of guy who would give someone the shirt off of his back after knowing them for all of 2 minutes, which isn't even exaggerating. He literally did that once. And, he was he still is the best friend that I ever had for good reason, and that's how I want him to be remembered. I can't even remember the name of this town we went to. And I mean, it's fucked up. Like, I've looked up every single small, scarcely populated town as I was trying to prepare for this recording, and no name rings a memory for me. I don't know, like, I didn't used to believe in paranormal things, but I'm starting to feel that somehow the big bird may have been able to erase parts of my memory. But anyway, whatever it was called, Billy and I went to the town to meet Jesse, and just as we had gotten there, it seemed to be just then that it got dark outside, which was perfect timing. I don't think I've mentioned this, but Jesse said that the Birdman was nowhere in sight until after dark. So we ended up waiting there for him to show up, and we ended up waiting for, a few hours. And after a while, I was about to call BS on Jesse's whole story and get the fuck out of there and go to bed. But then we saw something, which it wasn't the Birdman, but it is something that repeating. It is something that bears mentioning. There was this man who swore. Oh, I forgot to mention. The place that we were at was this Speedway gas station, which was right in the center of the town, and actually, from where we were, we could just about see every single border of the town. It was really, that small. And the area where we were situated was, closer to the rear of the store, on the side. So, anyway, we saw this man pulling up to the front of the store, right out of our line of sight. But from where we were, we could hear him hurrying up to the door and banging on it, in this very frantic manner. Even this 24-hour service station was keeping its doors locked because of this big bird that had, everyone scared. So I was actually kind of wondering to myself at the time what could have been worth the risk in the first place if everyone was supposed to be inside with their doors locked at that time of night. I mean, the closest I can think of now is maybe someone was sick, but I'm not aware of any kind of medicine that Speedway may have been carrying. But anyway, none of that really matters. It was just as I was starting to wonder about what he could have possibly been there for when we finally saw, the big bird. Billy was the first one to spot it, and he had to smack both Jesse and me on the arms to get our attention. And as I was looking at it, I have to admit that at first glance I did think it looked pretty absurd. Just as Jesse had mentioned, it's feathers were bright yellow, and I was thinking, for a man in a suit, its walk was pretty accurate to the way that a bird walks. Its legs were not like a bird's at all. They were actually pretty thick and, you know, more in the shape of a man's legs. I could see from a distance that there were these grooves in its legs, which made me think that he must have made these really intricately designed tights for the costume. But, yeah, it didn't even seem to notice that we were there. It just approached the store knowing that this man had gone inside and was going to come out at any minute. And Jesse and I ended up assuming that it was just going to jump out at him to, scare him out of his skin. It was even waiting around the corner of the store, out of sight of the doorway. So I ended up telling Jesse that we should get out of the car so that we could film what was happening up close, and he was all for it. And we even brought Billy out with us. Of course, he wanted to see Big Bird up close, but I kept him close by at my side in case things got hectic. And we approached the bird from behind as quietly as we could. At the time, we didn't think that we were in any real danger, but the reason we were quiet about it was because we didn't want to disturb this guy who we thought was about to pull some prank. So I heard the door open, I heard the locks close, and as my phone was recording it, the big bird dashed around the corner and out of our line of sight, which was when we heard this very loud, piercing scream. It was much higher than I thought a man could have uttered, and we all started giggling about this, which the bird must have heard, because in a heartbeat it was again in our sight and it was looking straight at us. Up close, everything about its form was bird-like, except for, the man-like legs that I mentioned, as well as the eyes. The eyes were forward-facing, and they seemed to carry this very human intelligence. It didn't appear to be amused by our appearance or even angry, but rather curious. I couldn't see any flaws in its face. There were no lines around the eyes where, the makeup would have ended. Just these smaller feathers, and the beak didn't look rubbery or even soft. It looked hard, like a real bird's beak. And I remember there was this thought that entered my head, which I found pretty amusing at the time. I thought to myself, God forbid they ever remake that awful sequel to The Neverending Story, but if they do, this guy should make the costume for that bird thing. And I was just about to say this out loud in hopes of maybe getting a laugh out of Jesse and hopefully out of the Birdman himself. But just before I could open my mouth, it opened its beak, and we could all see this wet, sort of cavernous mouth, which was far too wide for a human being. I felt Billy grip my hand very tightly, and I could feel him shaking. I don't know what expression he was wearing on his face, because my gaze was sort of transfixed on this mouth. And it didn't seem like it was trying to scare us. It didn't emit some loud squawking sound to ward us off. In fact, once it closed its mouth, it became clear that it was sort of somehow aware of what we were thinking about it. It seemed to know that we thought that it was just a man in a suit. And now that we realized how wrong we were, it seemed to have this look of glee in its eyes. They were very wide and had this sort of twinkle in them, as if it was pleased with itself. I then looked down at its feet, which I had not been paying close attention to since I had been observing the face so closely for any flaws, and its long toes were about the thickness of a thick rope, which, still wasn't wide enough for any grown man of that height to fit his feet into. But during all of this, I still wasn't scared. Not yet. I just felt more amazed by what I was seeing. But it was a moment later when fear hit me, as we heard this voice calling for help from around the corner of the store, and it was the man that we had seen pulling in. And I realized that we had not seen his car leaving, nor had I heard the store, nor had I heard the door to the store, opening and closing again after his scream. And it was as I was starting to realize this that I saw this hand covered in blood reach around the corner and hold on to it for support. And as the man stumbled into view, we could see that his other hand was pressed hard against his stomach, which had been sliced open. And it was then that I looked down at the talons at the end of the bird's toes, which were hooked and suitable for rendering flesh to shreds. As the man stood there, he looked at the bird, which, looked back at him, and that was when his life slipped away and he just collapsed onto the ground. And then the creature whipped its head around at us and started rushing in our direction, and immediately we rushed for the car. I lifted Billy from the ground and carried him, flung open the driver's side door, and placed him in the passenger seat. Jesse was observant enough to see that his former seat was now taken, but just as he reached the back door, he was lifted up from the ground and out of my sight. I quickly got out of the car again to see the bird flying in the air and carrying Jessie in its talons with tremendous strength. As it reached what seemed to be over 60 feet, it released Jesse and his body plummeted onto the hood of the car. And I could see that he was still alive because he was coughing up blood. My first impulse was to drag him from the hood and throw him into the back seat as quickly as I possibly could. But just as I grabbed onto his ankle, the bird took hold of his belt, jerked him from my grip, and threw him against the concrete. I didn't know what to do then. I was completely helpless as the creature turned him over and raised a foot to slash him open, and I turned my head down and got back into the car. I could not bear to see him die like that. But just as I was turning my gaze down, I knew that Billy had seen the whole thing because he started to scream his lungs out. And as I looked over at him, I could see that there were tears streaming down his cheeks. So, the rest of the night was pretty much a blur. Billy and I made it home safely. The next day, authorities from out of town got involved, and suddenly the locals didn't seem to have any knowledge of the big bird. And because they were being hush about it, I decided to keep my mouth shut about it as well. So I told the cops that Jesse, as well as the other man whose name turned out to be David, had been attacked by this man who was wielding what appeared to be some kind of sickle, at least. I said that was what it closely resembled, since I knew that talon wounds weren't going to exactly match those that could have been made by a sickle, according to the autopsy. Now, I don't care to give you the details of how shitty my life has been since then, but I know that anyone who is giving this story the time of day right now will want to know what became of Billy. And he's locked up right now. And I hope that this is going to be for good. And I'm not saying this out of spite. I still love my baby cousin, but I'm also scared of him. This drawing that I've been filming is one that he sent to me. That's me in the drawing, and as you can tell, he's not happy about me telling on him, as he puts it. So to kind of explain how this came about, after the night that Billy had witnessed all of this horror, he just went completely mute. He would not say a single word. Not only that, but he wouldn't make a sound. He didn't laugh. He didn't cry. He didn't even squeal with pain. So because of this, they kept him in a hospital for a while, where pediatricians and therapists did everything that they could to try to find a way to get him to speak again. And after almost a month of this, it was to no avail, and they ended up giving Billy back to his parents. And Uncle Jim and Aunt Teresa don't exactly have reason right now to be angry with me for what I did, because obviously I didn't tell them the truth of what happened. I just gave them the story that the reason we had gone down there was because Jesse needed a jump for his car. I don't know. I still feel like somebody needs to be as angry with me as I am with myself. I really don't feel like I deserve forgiveness for what I've done. One day, Aunt Teresa called me up and asked me if it would be okay if Billy could spend the weekend at my house, for the following weekend. And I said sure. And as soon as we were off the phone with each other, I had this idea. I figured that it would be a great idea to get a pet, um, to as a way to kind of coax Billy out of his silence. So I went to the pet store, and the most adorable animal that I could find there was this baby pug, which I brought home with me. And, even if Teresa and Jim didn't approve of animals in the house, I was perfectly fine with, you know, keeping him myself. Uh, Although I didn't give him a name, I was going to let Billy do that, and if I was going to be the one to keep him, then of course Billy was going to be welcome uh, to come over any day that he pleased so that he could play with the dog. But, you know, once I introduced him to the puppy, the result was a little disappointing. He, didn't hate it, but he wasn't quite as overjoyed as I figured a little boy would be given the situation. Um, and, being a puppy, the pug uh, rested its front legs on the side of his leg and started slobbering all over his hand. And, the most affection that he gave back was a light pat on the head. Uh, so the next morning, after Billy had spent one night over there, I went into the guest room where he was staying to find that he had done his own imitation of the big bird. And without talons, he did the best they could with one of my steak knives from the kitchen. And the pug was Jesse. And as I walked in and saw the aftermath of what he had done, Billy